Hi, welcome to the first real episode of the channel. This is The Warfarer. Alright, so we're starting off this new channel with our first video. So, we are going to do this first video, or I'm going to do this first video, on the Assyrian army from ancient Assyria. So, a little bit of background on the Assyrian Empire. They were a Mesopotamian empire, reaching its height around 700 to 600 BC, eventually falling to the Babylonians and then the Persians. So, some cool facts about the Assyrians before we start off. They were the first ancient army to use iron weapons, where most other nations were still using copper, tin, bronze even. They were already using iron in their armies, which was revolutionary and made their weapons much better than any other ones that anyone else was using. They also had armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Just to put that in perspective, the world population about that time was only a couple million. So having an army of hundreds of thousands was immense for that time period. There was also, because of the size of their army, an extremely militaristic society with even professional soldiers. So, long before the Romans or even Renaissance and modern times, they were having a professional, paid, well-trained army compared to most of the city-states of Mesopotamia at that time, which only had small city defense forces, or even larger empires like Babylon only having, still just recruited soldiers rather than professional ones. Alright, so with that, we're going to get started into the real breakdown of this video. So, first, how I'm going to do this is I'm going to give the weapons and the technology of the people, or the army in this case, and then the tactics that they use. I feel like some other channels seem to, speculate or talk about what would happen or what did happen, and then they turn back and explain, how the soldiers were and how they fought. But I see that as kind of backwards. We should know what we're dealing with and what we're talking about before we get into what actually would have happened, or their tactics and how they used it. So I'm going to break down each individual type of soldier in the army, and then how they were able to use those soldiers in different battles. Alright, so I'm going to start with just the basic infantry. So remember, they're using iron, which even for your common infantrymen was insane back then. Just having enough metal and having the standardization in weapons and armor was insane. So we're going to start with the heavy infantry, which is kind of your standard infantrymen. They wore iron helmets. They carried huge, usually like wicker or maybe sometimes, skins. I doubt they were wood at this point. But they carried large square or round shields, and then spears tipped with iron, and also they usually carried a short sword or dagger about this long, usually only single-sided, sometimes double-sided, just depending, no hilt either, or cross guard. It was just kind of really simple iron spike, basically. So the fact that all of these weapons were iron, and that almost every heavy infantryman was armed with one, made each infantryman an extremely lethal warrior. I will note, though, that your standard infantrymen did not really wear body armor, whatever tunic or, leather jerkin they could find to just throw on when they were going to battle. Body armor really wasn't prominently used at this point by any army. It did exist, but it wasn't really common for your average soldier. So officers definitely probably would have worn some kind of, I'm using a medieval term, but kind of a gambeson or some kind of scaled armor of some kind, metal or no. Alright, so once again, these guys were professional soldiers and they were well trained in all infantry formations. And so if you were an enemy army opposing these guys and you just see a wall of straight, huge square shields, iron spears, and guys with iron helmets, this is technology and tactics way beyond what most other armies were facing. The Assyrians really never lost many battles. They really lost because of infighting, rebellion, etc., or just overwhelming force of other empires. But they were an extremely powerful fighting force. Alright, so we're going to move on to the light infantry now. which is a bit different. They have the same sort of equipment, basically. They all wear those steel helmets, and they have the steel side swords. And they quite possibly and probably would have had some kind of shield, though they may have been smaller. However, their primary weapon, instead of being a steel-tipped spear, was instead a bow with steel-tipped arrows. Now, the Assyrian bow was also something that really had to be reckoned with. At this time, even the Assyrians were way ahead of their time with bows as well. They were already using recurve bows and compound bows made out of the sinews of animal fibers and animal bones. These recurve compound bows were extremely powerful and could fire hundreds of yards accurately. To put that in comparison, the classic English longbow used in throughout the early and Middle Ages, just like that was just a straight piece of wood. It was a standard bow. These compact compound recurve bows were much more powerful than even that, I would think, to some extent, though they were much smaller. And the light infantry would carry those. So now moving on from the infantry, we're moving into the cavalry sector of the Assyrian army. And for most of the history and for most battles, they used chariot. For those of you who don't know what a chariot is, it is a horse-pulled small cart with usually only 2 wheels, pulled by 2 to 4 horses, depending on what kind of chariot it is, how fast you want to go, things like that. Each chariot would have about 3 to 4 members in it. One, a driver, who, depending on the amount of members and the amount of skill of the other members in his chariot, would do nothing but drive the chariot and would be defended by the other members in the chariot. You would also have usually a spearman or a bowman, or sometimes, both of them combined into one, just a general attacker who would have a bow or a spear that would offensively use the chariot as the driver would steer it around. Sometimes you'd even have 2 of these. You'd also sometimes have a shield bearer of some kind who would have a large shield that would protect the driver and the gunner, I guess you could call him, if you're using, tank terms, from incoming fire or spears or swords or whatever people on the ground or in other chariots would try and use to take it down. So it has been known that they would have, something like 1 driver and 2 to 3 attackers and not really have a designated shield bearer. But you can kind of understand just the basics of what these guys were doing. The chariots were also revolutionary in and of themselves because instead of having 2 wheels on the front of the chariot, they had 2 wheels on the back of the chariot, which, though that doesn't sound like much, actually increased the maneuverability of the chariot a lot and made it much more durable as well, especially on rough ground. So the Assyrians also, to some extent, used regular cavalry as well as chariot soldiers. Though, because the stirrup had not really been invented yet, just the saddle, these were not the heavy shock cavalry of later times, such as a knight. These were more harassing and scouting forces, because they didn't have stirrups, so they could not absorb a large spear charge on a body of infantry. They would more kind of just run around and harass infantry formations or retreating enemies, or fight in small engaged battles where they could easily stab downward with their spear from their horse without actually getting into a massive charge. But once again, they used these less because they were just less effective on your general battlefield. So if you'd like to picture how the Assyrian army actually worked as a whole, one model is that you have a main body of spearmen, heavy infantry in the middle, creating your frontal line, with lines upon lines of light infantry behind them, supporting with arrows showering from overhead. The chariots would then wait on the flanks and come in and envelop the enemy once they had engaged on the front and the front began pushing them back. If the front began to buckle, the chariots would probably then cover their retreat as the infantrymen broke and fled and repositioned themselves. However, there is another alternate method to fighting, specifically with the infantry that the Assyrians would use. They would use a small unit system, kind of a tag team, I guess you could call it, where you'd have one heavy infantryman with a large shield and a spear protecting a light infantryman with a bow and arrow. And this created a small, mobile package with both ranged and close and melee power. And these small units fought very effectively, especially over large battlefields and as guards, and even in larger formations. If you just have that two-man system, you can make a very effective army without actually having to maneuver huge lines into battle. The cavalry, especially the chariots, were more shock troops, but they also, they were shock troops to an extent, but a lot of what they did was enveloping the enemy, since you can't really charge someone on a chariot without an extremely long spear. These chariots were heavily armored and really hard to take down. Since they had multiple crew members, they were able to work more efficiently than a single man on a horse, though they were a larger target. That about wraps up the open warfare tactics. But moving on to a different section, the Assyrians were also masters of siege warfare. Against most of, once again, the Mesopotamian city-states that were really the prominent government form around most of the area around there at the time of the Assyrian Empire. And so the Assyrians were one of the first peoples to consistently and effectively use siege weapons, meaning that they would use battering rams, and mostly battering rams, but they also used siege towers and use things like sappers to dig down walls, dig tunnels under walls, and even divert waterways and wells to prevent the inhabitants inside from being able to get water. Their battering rams were relatively simple, just two standard wooden logs stacked on top of each other with iron points on the ends, just basically giant spears. They would put them on wheels and then cover the entire assembly with damp leather to protect it from being set on fire by enemies. They would then just push this into a city gate and ram it until it opened or fell down. Though this was a simple tactic, it was brutally effective, and they were able to outlast and just break into most cities with their accurate archers, with their powerful bows, and their good siege equipment, and also the large reserve forces they'd keep around, that, like I said, sappers that would dig down walls